Hello, hello, hello. Happy Tuesday, everyone. So today I'm really excited to have with me James Masnov. James is a writer, musician, and historian. He is a graduate student at Portland State University, currently working on his thesis, which traces the history of judicial review's relationship to natural rights theory and the evolution of civil rights in the United States. And James actually came onto my radar because he recently published a piece with New Discourses, which is, of course, James Lindsay's site, all about basically trying to uncover what social justice actually means and demystify the cult of woke for all of us. And James wrote a great piece called "History Killers: The Academic Fraudulence of the 1619 Project." And so I hope that in this conversation, he's going to help us understand kind of what the 1619 Project is and why we should maybe be concerned about some of the assertions that have been made in this series. James, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Awesome. All right. So maybe we could just start off starting at the start. And what is the 1619 Project and why is it something that we should be focusing our attention on in this crazy time?
So I will give an absolutely fair presentation of the 1619 Project before I talk about any of my criticisms of it. 1619 Project is a series of essays that began being published in August of last year, August of 2019, published by the New York Times Magazine, headed up by Nicole Hannah-Jones, and it's an American history project focused on colonial America and the American Revolution specifically, and then those aspects of those eras that run up to today, including slavery, endemic racism, etc. And it's called the 1619 Project because part of its thesis is that we should look at the history of the United States not from 1776 forward, but from 1619, which was the year that slaves were first brought to North America by the British. I have some issues with that sort of framing, but that is why they call it the 1619 Project. And my criticism of it has nothing to do with that part of the issue. But that is essentially its thesis, and we can get into my article that attacks a very different part of its thesis in its first essay.
Okay. Well, I mean, let's maybe start there. And I think, one of the assertions that you write about in your article is you say Nicole Hannah-Jones claims that the protection of slavery was one of the key motivators for the American Revolution. And she asserts that left out of our founding mythology is the fact that one of the primary reasons some of the colonists decided to declare their independence from Britain was because they wanted to protect the institution of slavery. By 1776, Britain had grown deeply conflicted over its role in the barbaric institution that had reshaped the Western Hemisphere. In other words, we may never have revolted against Britain if some of the founders had not understood that slavery empowered them to do so, nor if they had not believed that independence was required to ensure that slavery would continue. Tell us about that assertion.
Well, that assertion is wrong. There's no way of getting around it, and this is not a left or right issue. This is not an ideological or political matter. Historians who live all across the political spectrum have criticized Nicole Hannah-Jones and this essay specifically, this launch, the first launched essay of the 1619 Project, specifically for this part of her thesis, that the American Revolution was fought in order to preserve slavery on behalf of Americans. And it's just not true. We can criticize the institution of slavery and its very close relationship with the American founding. It would be wrong to act as though that's not a real thing. The problem is that the 1619 Project is trying to take a number of things and act like they are all occupying the same space, and they are not. We can be critical of the history of slavery in the United States and in the North America preceding the United States, and still understand that it is historically inaccurate to say that the revolutionaries of the American Revolution were doing so in order to protect slavery. It's just not true. And historians from across the board have said as much.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's unpack this a little bit, because I know, from my perspective, and one of the things I really appreciated about your article is you do have a very balanced perspective of the situation. You are very open in saying we should consider racism and slavery in our history, and there should be more weight on that, and there should be more discussion about that, but simply not as the central thesis for the founding of the country. So, and when as I was reading your essay, I was thinking back to, I went to school in Boston. I could literally walk to where the Boston Massacre took place. I know exactly where it is. I can point it. I always point it out when I bring people around Boston, right by Faneuil Hall. And so when I think of some of the triggers of the American Revolution, obviously my perspective is based on what was going on in the North, which had nothing to do with slavery, so far as I understand it. Am I wrong?
Right. No, you're absolutely right. And if you look at things like the military history of the American Revolution, it started in the North. It started in the Northeast. And the battles perpetually worked their way down. Through military strategy, the British, over a period of years, began to believe that they had a better chance of winning if they kept going more and more southward in having their battles. So this was pure military strategy. It actually has nothing to do with slavery, save for the fact, and this is another thing the 1619 Project does with their conflation. There's a Lord Dunmore's proclamation, which was the British told, let it be known to slaves in the South that if they rebelled against their masters, they would earn their freedom. Now, this is historically true. Dunmore's proclamation is true, and we need to understand its importance. The 1619 Project should be lauded for talking about this history. It's something that more Americans should know about. The problem, though, is that they act as though this is proof of the American mission of revolution to protect slavery. What they actually omit, and it's a lie by omission, in my opinion. What they omit is that only Tories, only the loyalists who were slave owners, only the revolutionaries had this proclamation work against them. Loyalists, Tories who owned slaves, had nothing to worry about. So in fact, British loyalists who owned slaves didn't have to worry about this proclamation. So it was purely a military strategy, and one that didn't particularly work well anyway.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, so that's really interesting, and that seems to undercut that. That's just one component that undercuts that central thesis, right?
Yeah, but to your point, certainly the American Revolution started largely in Boston with the Sons of Liberty, and in other parts of the Northeast, and it slowly worked its way down, and there were all sorts of interests who ended up finding themselves benefiting from the idea of revolution, but the protection of slavery was not one of them.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and in fact, I seem to remember, and again, it's been a while since I have brushed up on my early colonial history, but I mean, there seemed to actually be some conflict between the founders that were from the North and from the South over the role that slavery was playing in our society. Am I wrong about that?
Oh no, you're definitely right about that. If we can blame the North, people in the North for anything, it would be a complicity of silence. Maybe people today would call it some sort of complicity of silence.
Their silence was violence.
And yeah. But actually, it was an inconvenient fact of the matter that the United States had to keep its unity with the North basically being okay with the slavery. And another thing that I think it's a post-Civil War psychology that happens with Americans today is we think of slavery as being a Southern institution. But at the time of the dawning of the American Revolution, slavery existed in every state, in every colony turned state. And so you had slaves in Massachusetts, you had slaves in New York. What happened was, through the revolution and in the 1780s, between the American Revolution, the revolution's end, and the constitutional period, you have about 4 or 5 years there. People sometimes ask, why didn't slavery end, after the American Revolution? And the fact is, in some places it did. In Massachusetts specifically, a series of court cases called the Clockworker cases. This will actually be one component of my thesis. A series of court cases in Massachusetts in the 1780s ended up getting rid of slavery precisely because it was a violation of natural rights. And it was recognized as that through their charter of their state constitution. They realized, okay, this idea of slavery and the idea of natural rights cannot live together. And so through a series of cases, Massachusetts phased out slavery. And in other states in the North, they phased it out a little bit more slowly. But by the middle of the 19th century, you really only had slavery existing in the South. But at the time of the American Revolution, slavery existed everywhere.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think that's fascinating that it almost seemed, well, dare I say, the system kind of worked in that instance where there was a fundamental conflict and they realized it. And over the course of years, probably they corrected it.
Yeah, definitely.
Is that ever acknowledged in the 1619 Project?
Oh, no, because it's really important for the 1619 Project to promote a somewhat Marxist as well as postmodernist. And I know those two things are not the same. People have criticized Jordan Peterson for using those terms in the same sentence, and they are different, but they sometimes run in the same circles. And the 1619 Project is very interested in promoting an anti-capitalist sort of vision of history, especially by trying to equate slavery with capitalism. And I'm actually glad to have the opportunity to mention this, because this is not in my article, but I think it's a really important critique also of the 1619 Project, is that they try to conflate slavery with capitalism. And to do so is rather crude and it's completely historically inaccurate. In fact, if you look at the writings of slave apologists of the South in the 19th century, what you actually find is that they are not defending slavery for capitalistic reasons. They are actually anti-capitalists because they're defending slavery. And they make no sort of bones about that. If I could read you something really quick.
Yeah.
As part of my research from just a couple months ago, there was this guy, George Fitzhugh, who was an apologist for slavery. And part of his reasons was that he was against capitalism. So let me just look here. It's a mistake that many make, including some historians, when they argue that slavery was part of the capitalist process in the United States. Slavery was, in fact, at odds with liberal capitalism. One need look no further than the writings of George Fitzhugh, an apologist for Southern slavery in the first half of the 19th century. Fitzhugh argued that Northern capitalism, defined by its lack of slavery and the use of free labor, was exploitative of free labor. He argued that at least Southern slaves were taken care of by their masters. Fitzhugh, one of the most vocal advocates of slavery, defended the institution precisely because it was not a form of liberal capitalism. And as historian Irving H. Bartlett has stated, quote, Fitzhugh's attack on free society was essentially an attack on the laissez-faire philosophy. So slavers were not capitalists. They were actually, in fact, extremely anti-capitalist.
So if they're anti-capitalist, how might we classify them today based on, the spectrum that exists in that realm? What do you think?
Well, what's difficult about that is that the things that you would have to compare it to, you'd have to compare it to other things in their own time. Mm-hmm. It's hard to compare that to things today. So really feudalism. It would be, if you look at feudalism of 19th century Russia, it'd be something closer to that, where you have a feudal society. And what the slavers were trying to do was they were trying to preserve a feudal system. And capitalism with its, and there are issues with capitalism, do not get me wrong, but the whole idea of free markets is the opportunity for one to work for themselves, to earn the fruits of their own labor. and therefore is completely antithetical to slavery.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about it in that way before, and I think that makes perfect sense. I want to go back to something you wrote about relatively early on in your article, which was the fact that Nicole Hannah-Jones says that she basically says that America was not founded as a democracy, and I know it's not a democracy. You make that fundamental distinction between a democracy and a constitutional republic, and I want you to go over that with us. But she even goes further and says it was founded as a slaveocracy.
Right.
What does that mean?
Well, I think that's a reassertion or a sort of underscoring of her argument that the American Revolution itself was a movement to protect slavery. And that's what she's arguing. That's my guess. I don't want to put words in her mouth. I'm guessing that that's the point she's trying to make, is that it was a slaveocracy because, according to her, the American Revolution was done in order to protect slavery. It's historically wrong. She's wrong. But I think that's where she's coming from.
Okay. What is the difference between a democracy and a constitutional republic?
It's very important that people understand that being a constitutional republic is more important, in fact, more essential than being a democracy. And since the progressive era, the United States citizens and office holders alike have generally called the United States a democracy. And it's kind of understandable why. Through the progressive era, which has its own issues, some of the things that happened was you had a progress, especially of the women's suffrage movement, was probably the most essential achievement of the progressive era. And it carried democracy forward, the notion of democracy. And ever since, many people have called the United States a democracy. It makes sense why we do, because we generally believe in the enfranchisement of the entire constituency. There's something that we believe in. We believe in the democratic process. The problem is that because we've come to really believe in the democratic process, we have a blind spot that people like the American founders didn't have, which is that they understood the tyranny of the majority. And what a constitutional republic does versus a democracy is that it staves off that tyrannical mob. It basically says democracy is wonderful because we believe in the will of the people. But how good is democracy, or what good is democracy, if the result is the people voting their own rights away? And so a Republican model basically takes the idea of individual rights and the maximization of individual autonomy and tries to maximize that as much as possible, sometimes to the detriment of democracy. A lot of people don't think about the Bill of Rights being in many ways doctrines of anti-democratic thought, right? Because we think of these things interchangeably, but in fact, your freedom of speech exists no matter what other people think, right? Your freedom is to exist even if 99% of the people disagree with you and think that you shouldn't be able to speak.
Bill de Blasio might have an issue with that right now, but let's go with that.
Right. So in many ways, the most essential freedoms we have, the most essential individual rights we have as an anti-democratic check against mob mentality. And that's why it's really important to remember that we are a republic rather than a democracy.
Okay. I mean, so let's talk about that a little bit, though. And I want to just depart from 1619 for 1 second, because that point today actually seems especially relevant.
Yes.
Yeah. So you live close to Portland, right? About an hour away.
Yep.
How might you apply that idea to what we see going on in our society right now, and especially in places like Portland, like Seattle, where it does seem like mob rule is kind of winning the day?
Yeah, there's a whole confluence of things happening in Portland and Seattle and other major cities, but especially around here in the Pacific Northwest. And I want to answer your question, but I think it's a number of things at once. I think it's the individual versus the mob. I think that's definitely happening. But you also have very sort of classically American tensions happening right now as well, which is federal control over local control is especially happening in Portland. And people are debating how, whether it's right that the feds are bringing in whether you want to call them troops or police, police powers or what have you, versus the local and state governments having the power and the autonomy to handle this stuff themselves. Some might argue that they have not taken care of the problem themselves, and that's why the federal powers are coming in. People can debate that. So I think there's a number of things happening. You have the individual versus the mob, and you also have local and state versus federal. So there's, but I agree with you that this is the things we're talking about and sort of the intellectual historical world that I travel in is actually very relevant right now, because it is about what is the balance between popular will and individual rights. Mm-hmm. And that is honestly the American story. That's something that we've been struggling with for the entirety of the history of the Republic. But I do feel like we've come to a really critical moment of understanding that. So some of the work that I do has actually become rather prescient all of a sudden. I remember talking about, because I work in intellectual history and legal history, and I'm fascinated by the organizing of society. How is it that a vast group of people decide the values that they're going to live by? I've always been fascinated by this idea and how they express themselves differently around the world and throughout history. And that can be a very dry sort of often the ether theoretical thing to talk about. And it was when I would talk to people about kind of what I was interested in, what I worked in, even just a few years ago. But now all of a sudden, people understand that the way a society organizes itself is really important.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so kind of, applying that and looking back at the way the founders were organizing things, what can we ascertain about maybe a more accurate view of history? What were the founders' intents around how they were organizing society back then? Do you think?
Well, I think it's they are matters that seem very abstract to us, or we take them for granted now. Very few, no matter what one thinks about the American founding or the American founders, what's historically interesting about them is that they are one of the very few generations in world history, let alone American history, in world history, where they were a generation that ended up being able to decide what government they wanted to live under. Mm-hmm. And did so in a way that sustained itself for a long period of time. That is extremely rare. And so, if people want to debate the values of the founders or the founding, or in revering them and whatnot, I'm willing to have that conversation. But I do think that we should be intellectually honest and look at the success of things like due process, separation of powers, judicial review, the jury system. People being afforded their rights, especially when they've been accused of a crime. These things are unbelievably important. And they didn't all start with the American system. Some of them were inherited from an older British model. But that's kind of also the point. There's a long history of sort of a refining of rights values, and these rights values then organizing a governmental system. And okay, well, how can we protect people's rights? And then people are like, well, there's this entire population of people over here who have no rights. And then that becomes a tension. And there's a struggle through that, whether it's women or whether it's African Americans or whether it's, the LGBT community, whether it's immigrants, whatever it is, there's a constant tension of rights and how do we afford everybody their rights. That is really the American mission. And that's not even a political statement. That is historically true. That has been the trajectory of the American model. So I think what can be learned from the founding, for as absolutely flawed as those figures were, they were brilliant in the idea that power in any one place is dangerous. And you diffuse the power among as many persons and institutions as possible in order to maximize liberty. And that is actually a profound worldview. And it has a lot to do with the fact that the founders, whatever else you might want to say about them, were extremely historically literate. Yeah. They knew history. And because they knew history, they knew human nature. I do think that sometimes some of the problems we have right now is a lack of historical literacy, which then also leads to a lack of an understanding of human nature. Mm-hmm. This idea of human perfectibility.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I think that, another thing that I see coming up over and over again is just this lack of willingness to have a nuanced conversation about some of these ideas. And, anytime I've looked back at the founders, they were not perfect men, but they were good men. And they had wisdom, and they may not have made every decision perfectly, but they put in place a system that, the Declaration of Independence did not have to, basically say that all men were created equal. They created that. They had no obligation to say all men are created equal when they wrote that, or when Thomas Jefferson wrote that document. And it seems that the intent of doing so is completely contradictory to this idea of our founding as a slaveocracy.
Yeah. Well, and what's funny about that to me is people today, when they say, oh, well, the founders, especially the slave owning class like Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Mason, etc., that they were such hypocrites. And do you think they didn't know they were hypocrites? All you have to do is, open up some of the writings of Jefferson, for example. And when he talks about slavery, this is a guy who owned hundreds of human beings, hundreds. And yet, what did he say about slavery in his personal and public writing? He said that he trembles when he realizes that God's judgment cannot rest forever. He knew slavery was wrong. He knew in his own time slavery was wrong. And it's one of the sort of fascinating things about the American founders as well, specifically the slave owners, and makes them very different from the later generations of American slave owners, is that they were much more honest about knowing the institution of slavery was wrong and publicly reckoning that they didn't know what to do about it than the very next generation of people like Andrew Jackson and John C. Calhoun, who just defended slavery and said there was nothing wrong with it. Mm-hmm. And there's a huge difference there. And, maybe some people would say, well, they were just doing that for historical posterity, or what have you. And, there might be something to that because they were historically illiterate people. But I think because they wrestled with strong intellectual tensions all the time, they knew they had to reckon with slavery, at least in terms of a thought process, at least leave something behind to say that, yes, we struggled with this. We benefited from it, and we also struggled with knowing what to do about it, which casts them as completely different from every other slave-owning generation after them.
Mm-hmm. I take that idea, and I really do wonder how much they were consciously aware of how much their personal and public writings were going to be just scrutinized and looked over today. Because if you look at even just where we are at right now as a society, I feel like we are living in a moment that is going to have historical significance. But is that something that we're thinking about on a daily basis, of like everything I write and put out there, and even maybe this YouTube video, who knows, will become a piece of like historical artifact? I think that when you're actually in the moment, it strikes me that it might be very different. The intent and even the thought process might be different than what we might perceive it if we're looking back on it. What do you think?
Wow, that's a really big question.
Sorry.
No, it's great. I'm inclined to agree with you. I wonder if there's a loss of currency, a loss of value in the written word, that we take it for granted so much, even prior to social media, but especially since the advent of social media. We really take it for granted that the written word just goes around the world, and people, well, you and I both know people respond to the written word sometimes in unbelievable ways. But what's missing to me is the understanding that the written word has value in the sense that you can write something down. You can write a person, a deeply, deeply flawed person can write that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and among these was endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That those written words are world-changing. And so maybe the value of words has been lost, and maybe our understanding of the value of words there's been a cheapening. I think part of that cheapening is the vast insults that people lob at each other. And, I don't know which came first. I don't know if the cheapening of the language informed the politicization or vice versa, but I think they're somehow connected.
Well, I mean, I also think, I agree with what you said, but then in the back of my head, I'm going, Benjamin Franklin was kind of a troll. He was.
Yes,
Benjamin Franklin was like the original troll, right?
That's actually a really good point. Yeah. Then again, people understood satire.
Yeah.
In the 18th century, and it's hard sometimes because I know some people are going to listen to this and they're going to, there's going to be people who are like, oh, well, they're defending slave owners and things like that. We have to understand that we're talking about fully formed human beings that includes positive aspects and negative aspects, as it's true of all of us.
Mm-hmm.
But another positive aspect of that generation, of at least the literary types and the political thinkers, was that they understood satire, they understood humor, and they really valued good faith arguments.
Mm-hmm.
Good faith argumentation was evidence that you're living in a civilization, that you're going to kind of speak to your highest form, your best self, and you're going to expect the best self, the best version of your opponent. Mm-hmm. And this good faith is gone. And what I'm wondering is how we get it back, because I'm more than happy, because you said this about my article, I'm more than happy to have conversations about, the reckoning of monuments, the issue of the impact of slavery, and how, its lasting impacts, systemic racism. I'm more than happy to have those arguments. As a historian, as an American historian, I don't see how you can't have those conversations. What I'm not seeing is a good faith conversation kind of going in the other direction of, well, can we admit that due process is a good thing? Can we admit that jury trials are a good thing? Can we admit that if somebody is acquitted and we really think that they were guilty, we don't bemoan the process, we actually champion the process and say, well, this one was a bad decision, but we move on. There's been a loss of good faith in sort of the best aspects of the American system.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree with everything you just said, and I want to dig into that a little bit more, but I just want to do a quick pause and take a couple questions that are relevant to some things that we've already discussed. And guys, if you're enjoying this conversation, please make sure you give it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I try to have interesting guests like James on here to actually have nuanced conversations. Isn't it nice to have a nuanced conversation, James?
Very much so. Very much.
So I have a question from Kimmy from my locals community, and she has a question for you about Washington and Jefferson that seems relevant to some of the things we've talked about. And she asks, I have read that Washington and Jefferson both inherited their slaves and could not legally set them free and were thus unwilling slaveholders. Can your guest confirm this?
Half true and not true. Mm-hmm. And true. So half true in that, yes, both Washington and Jefferson inherited slaves. They already had slaves. So they already had slaves, but then they got more, especially through their marriages. So when Washington married Martha Custis, he inherited her family plantation, and the same happened when Jefferson married his to-be wife. And actually, I really appreciate the question, because what this does is it shows how nuanced this issue is. So they're already slave owners, so that's not couched in, well, they inherited these slaves, but they did inherit a number of their slaves as well. And is it true that they could not get rid of slaves? Actually, yes. Virginia law at the time, especially while Jefferson was alive, I don't know if this was true for Washington at the time, but certainly because Jefferson outlived Washington by a couple of decades. But what I do know is true is that in the early 19th century, Virginia had a law that it didn't ban people from freeing their slaves, but what it did was that if you freed your slaves, those slaves were legally bound to leave the state.
Oh.
Because they did not want free blacks in the state. And so what this did was it created another layer of sort of a problem. Like, even if one wanted to free their slaves, you had to then also give them money and means to make it to another state and to try to make a life for themselves. So, and just there was actually a cost of freeing a slave. You actually paid for their manumission, it was called. You paid for their slave. So it was an added cost of paying for their freedom, and then paying for them to be able to make it out of the state alive. And because it was literally a crime to be a free slave in Virginia. And so,
wow.
So there's all of this complexity to this issue. So yes, they inherited slaves, but they already owned slaves. But yes, it is true that in a number of legal ways and economic ways, it was not very easy to free one's slaves, especially in places like Virginia. I did want to mention, because I feel like this gave me the opportunity with Thomas Jefferson. Some of us know about Sally Hemings. There are still historians who might disagree about the nature of the relationship with Sally Hemings. There's definitely DNA of her offspring having Jefferson DNA. We don't know that it's him or another member, a male member of the Jefferson family, but let's just say it was Jefferson. Let's just say I'm willing to certainly accept that idea. What you don't often hear about, and you made me think of this, is because of the inherited slave thing. Sally Hemings was a slave inherited to Jefferson through his marriage, the Hemings family. But Sally Hemings was Jefferson's wife's half-sister.
Okay.
Jefferson's father-in-law was Sally Hemings' father.
Okay. I'm like doing the family tree in my head right now.
So Jefferson lost his wife. She died while he was in his late 30s, maybe early 40s. And then the likely relationship he had with Sally Hemings, and she was very young, happened after the death of his wife. Was there some connection in terms of how they looked, in terms of their disposition? They were half sisters. Now, this probably wasn't very openly talked about, but all you have to do is look through the records, and it's very obvious that Sally Hemings was the half sister of Jefferson's dead wife. This doesn't make slavery okay. This doesn't make the nature of that relationship less troubling, but what it does is it complicates the issue. And so any of these things we should be willing to talk about and understand. This is really complex stuff.
No, it's incredibly complex. I had no idea that they were related, and so that's actually really fascinating. I mean, did she remind him of him? Was it one of those things where he lost his wife and someone that looks like her is right there?
Right. Yeah, we don't know.
Who knows? That's fascinating.
I really appreciate that question.
Matthew has a question that's more modern day. Thank you, Matthew. Are multinational corporations modern day slavers that have their products made in China by people in work camps and some other Chinese companies? What do you think, James?
I think that's a fascinating question, and I'm more empathetic to it than some people might think. I call myself a radical moderate. I have
I
probably
like
voted
that.
I have probably voted Democrat most between the two parties in my time. I've voted Republican at times. I've voted third party probably the most over the years. I'm not I'm not married or bound to any political party or ideology, and because of that, I feel like I can look at some of this stuff a little bit more objectively. And I think the way the two major parties pushed so-called free trade for about 30 years was detrimental in many ways to the American worker, as well as to all sorts of populations around the world, including the working poor in China. So would I call it slavery? I don't know that I'd call it slavery, but I do think there's something to that question. That there's certainly a form of exploitation, taking homegrown jobs away from American workers so they can, be done more cheaply by the working poor in other parts of the world. I do think there's something to that.
Mm-hmm. Matthew has another question too, or maybe just a statement that might complicate things even more. He says, most of the founding fathers were in massive debt to British companies and could not release their slaves as they were collateral on the loan. Is that true?
That is true in some cases. You don't want to overstate that fact. The Jefferson's probably the best case of this. Jefferson was so much in debt, not just to the British, but to all sorts of people around the world, that he literally did not have the money to free his slaves. He was so much in debt. So there are certainly aspects of that are true. I wouldn't want to overstate that and act as though that were true for every American slave owner of that generation. But there's certainly truth to it.
Cool. Thank you for that. I want to go back to something you wrote in your piece, and I want to just read a portion of it to kind of get back to some of the historical inaccuracies in the 1619 Project. And I keep wanting to call it the 1669 Project in my head, so if I misspeak at some point, just please forgive me. You all know what I'm talking about, but 1619. But you write, Leslie M. Harris, who wrote an opinion piece in Political titled, I helped fact check the 1619 Project, the Times ignored me. In the article published in March 2020, Harris states, I vigorously disputed the preservation of slavery claim. Although slavery was certainly an issue in the American Revolution, the protection of slavery was not one of the main reasons the 13 colonies went to war. She goes on, despite my advice, the Times published the incorrect statement about the American Revolution anyway in Hannah Jones's introductory essay. Perhaps more powerfully, Harris observes, the complicated picture of the Revolutionary era that the New York Times missed. White Southerners might have wanted to preserve slavery in their territory, but white Northerners were much more conflicted, with many opposing ownership of enslaved people in the North, even as they continued to benefit from investments in the slave trade and slave colonies. More importantly, for Hannah Jones's argument, slavery in the colonies faced no immediate threat from Great Britain, so colonists wouldn't have needed to succeed to protect it. Can you unpack that a little bit for us? Because there's a lot going on right there. From the point of there being an actual fact checker that told the New York Times this
Right.
is incorrect to some of the further interpretation and what went on.
Yeah. So to me, the comments by Leslie Harris is the smoking gun, proving the sort of illegitimacy of the 1619 Project. Leslie M. Harris is a very highly regarded historian, PhD at Northwestern, and her work is largely in the history of slavery. She knows this as well as any historian does, and she offered her analysis to the 1619 Project prior to the publication of its first article, and they just decided to ignore her. Now, if it were just, why would you reject a sort of, a highly credited and respectable historian? People might have all sorts of reasons to do so, but she is an expert in the field, and she told them prior to publication where they got things wrong, and they decided to go with it anyway. So this leads to my point in the article, in part, that the 1619 Project is a political project. Yeah. It's not history. It's not history, because if they cared about the history, they would have included Leslie Harris's notes, and corrected the issue. And all Leslie Harris did was point out what historians after publication also pointed out, which is that the preservation of slavery had nothing to do with the American Revolution. But this was a highly regarded historian telling them before publication, and they ignored her. And I really commend her for coming out and writing that article for Politico saying as much, because somebody else might have just swept that under the carpet. I'm really glad she didn't. So yeah, I think that is the smoking gun that really underscores the illegitimacy of the 1619 Project.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think so many people are remaining silent about all of this?
I think some people view history as a political endeavor, that you have to take sides, and that, something else I talk about in the article, we pretend that all monuments were created equally evil. I think is how I put it.
I love this part of the article, actually. Keep going.
Well, to me, and saying this as a historian in training, that why we put up monuments should matter. So a lot of this is not one I talk about in the article, but a lot of Columbus monuments are coming down. And I don't really have too much of an opinion on whether they should stay up or come down. I do think that it should be legally decided and not be decided by violent mobs. But if a community wants to take such monuments down, they have every right to, provided that they follow a legal means, a process of doing it, where there can be a community forum and people can talk about it and discuss it. But what's being forgotten with the Columbus monuments, in many cases, I'm not saying this is true across the board, but in many cases, a lot of the Columbus monuments were put up in the early 20th century as homages to the Italian-American experience. It was Italian-American groups who had, had their own forms of prejudice and whatnot when they were among immigrant groups to first come over. And when they started seeing real success in their communities in the 20th century, they put up monuments of Christopher Columbus, not because he had slaughtered a bunch of natives and enslaved others and brought European imperialism to the Americas. That's not why those monuments were put up. They were put up as a source of pride of the Italian-American experience. That should matter. That reasoning should matter, and that's lost on all these. And again, that's not necessarily true of every Christopher Columbus monument that's been put up, but it should matter. And what this relates to, that is in the article, is the difference between Confederate monuments and monuments to the founders. In my opinion, that Confederate monuments that were put up in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, often in order to sort of reassert a white supremacist culture, especially in the South, under Jim Crow, that's why they were put up. These monuments were put up because these figures were slave owners.
Right.
Monuments to Jefferson, monuments to Washington, monuments to James Madison, monuments to George Mason were not put up because they were slave owners. They were put up despite these people being slave owners. And that intention really makes a difference, as to, we're revering this person despite their most horrible, egregious flaws, versus we're putting these up because of their most egregious, horrible flaws. Mm-hmm. That distinction should matter. And that's the part of historical literacy and intellectual nuance that's completely lacking right now.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that distinction that you made in the article was so important for me. And I think it's something that one of the things I'm most afraid of in this time is that the intent behind the things that happened 200 years ago is completely lost. So you are actually studying history right now as a graduate student, right?
Yeah.
In
Yes.
the conversations that you're having with your faculty and with other students, are people considering that intention behind these things, or is it a different conversation? Without trying to get you in too much trouble.
No. I really appreciate that because, look, I'm a grad student at Portland State. Like, it would be really easy for an outsider, especially anybody who knows much about the reputation of Portland State, to be like, ooh, you know, I must have a target on my back. But I must say that the history department has been extremely fair, extremely kind. My advisor and my professors are, they're university professors, so they almost entirely lean left. Some are, left of center, and some are outright Marxists. And yet every single one has been really fair in, look, if I have made a sound argument, they admit it. And it's been great to have that sort of dialogue. So one thing to always, and I've fallen short of this sometimes too, one thing to always remember is that the sort of reputation of an institution may not be what is true about a specific department within it. And so I've been very lucky to be surrounded by really, really good historians. And by really good historians, I mean they are absolutely fair. They take facts objectively, and in their own scholarship, they might fire it through a sort of Marxist lens or whatever, but they are not the sort of shouting down history killing class that I'm talking about in that article. They actually enjoy dialogue and enjoy talking with people that they disagree with.
Mm-hmm. And
so I've had a very good experience.
That's actually really good to hear, because I think when, I'm my head is in this area so much, and I'm sure this is true of many of the people watching live right now, that it can be very easy to make assumptions about all faculty are just, leftists and just want to impose their worldview. And that's just not the case. I mean, I think one of the things that's so interesting about history is to have these discussions and to have the debates about nuance. I mean, what would be, I can't imagine going into a field like that and wanting to just, have conversations with people to agree with you. There's no fun there, right?
Right. There's no fun there, and there's nothing to be learned.
Right.
If we all already agree with each other, what are we doing here? Right?
Exactly. Matthew has another question, and I want to say too, Anthony Brian Logan, thank you for the super chat. You didn't ask a question, so I'm not going to put it on the screen, but I very much appreciate it. Matthew wants to know, do some historians downplay some of the founders' religious beliefs and call them deists to attack the founding of the country and the founding documents? What do you think?
Some historians probably do, and others don't. This is another thing. The founders were no one thing. So some were quite religious, although very few of, when we say founders, we're talking about scores and scores of people. So that's something to keep in mind. But if we're talking about the usual suspects that say that the 5 or 10 figures that we usually think of when we think of the founding, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, etc., Adams, most of them were not Orthodox Christians. But that's not to say that they were not religious. Certainly somebody like John Adams was definitely a religious man. Were they called deists to downplay their religious sensibilities? No, because they weren't all deists, and I don't think historians, at least no good historians, are calling all the founders deists. Jefferson was a deist, and that's just a fact. And in fact, so is Benjamin Franklin. If you read Benjamin Franklin's very slim autobiography, which he wrote before he became a revolutionary, he talks about his deism in his own autobiography. This isn't something that was made up later. It's a mistake to act as though all of the founders were deists, just as it would be a mistake to assume that they were all religious. Jefferson wrote what later became known as the Jefferson Bible. He took a razor blade to the Gospels, literally. Jefferson took a razor blade to the Gospels, and he physically cut out every miracle, every one of Christ's miracles in the New Testament, in the Gospels, and published a form of the New Testament, or at least of the Gospels, without Christ's miracles. And he did that because he was a deist. He didn't believe in miracles. So there's two ways of looking at this. There's one way to be like, oh, wow, he was like, his deism verged on atheism, which he was attacked in that way in his own time, that he was, if he was a deist, he was an atheist. But in fact, if you read his writings about why he was compelled to do such a thing, he was a huge fan of Christ, and he actually believed that Christ was the most impressive human being who ever walked the earth, and that we don't need his miracles to learn from his example, which is, wow, that's what a fresh perspective. So we got to be really careful in how we look at this stuff. We can't assume that Jefferson was an atheist because he was a deist and because he cut the miracles out of the Gospels. He was actually a profoundly religious man in that sense, and he was really influenced by Christ, and just didn't think that the miracles mattered. And it would also be a mistake to act as though all the founders were deists, or that all the founders, it would be like saying that all the founders were slave owners, which is obviously also not true.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. I couldn't help but think, and I actually remember reading Franklin's autobiography in college that you brought it up. But it's striking to me how much more patience people had back then than they do now. For Jefferson to undertake that simply because he wanted to have a look at things without the miracles, I think that's just like, it's such a dichotomy from where we are now, with everything about being instant gratification, and I want my results now, and I don't want to wait 10 seconds for an ad on YouTube. I mean, it's just, it says a lot about how, in many respects, I think technology has been a burden on how we exist now, rather than something that supports maybe an experience and a lifestyle that we would want or choose.
Yeah, and how much of that is independent human agency? Before we officially started, you and I were talking about social media, and I'm more or less checked out. I make appearances. I'll come on the radio or do wonderful programs like this, and I do my own podcast, the Disabuse podcast. But in terms of putting myself out there on social media, I have found it to be unbelievably toxic and really not worth my time. And at some point it starts to be like, well, I guess all of this stuff is candy, and how much candy should you be taking in? Like, maybe you can have a little bit of candy a little bit of the time, but I probably shouldn't be eating candy every day. I probably shouldn't be eating candy 12 times a day, and so maybe I shouldn't be checking my social media 12 times a day. And I blame the culture. The culture is a real thing, but the culture is also made up of individual human beings making this choice to constantly eat candy. Mm-hmm. And so what I can do is I can be like, I'm going to eat a little bit less candy.
No, I think it's a fair point. And, but what it makes me think of is, even going back to, and this was after the founding, I think, I don't remember exactly when this was, but I'm thinking of Bleeding Sumner in Massachusetts, and I'm thinking of, like, as much uppityness as we see on social media today. I mean, the early the colonists had their own version of uppityness, right? I mean, literally, Charles Sumner was beaten with a cane by someone who didn't like his opinion, right?
You made me think of something I was really hoping to remember to mention. So James Lindsay and Benjamin Boyce and a number of people have talked about the evergreening of America, or the evergreening of the world. And it's actually very similar to something, I said something similar to a friend of mine who came to visit. We now live in different parts of the country, but he came to visit me last summer. We hadn't seen each other in a few years. And I actually said something very similar to him about that. I actually lived in Olympia for 5 years earlier in my adulthood. And after 5 years, I was so done. I left Olympia because the sort of woke scold world that we live in now was happening in Olympia 20 years ago. And I just got so tired of it. And then the irony is I left Olympia and then the whole world became Olympia. So there's that. And so in that way, I agree with James Lindsay. I agree with Benjamin Boyce. I think Mike Nana has said something similar. The evergreen, Brent Weinstein as well, the evergreening of America or the evergreening of the world. I think they're right. I agree with them, but I think there's a better way of putting it. It seems kind of antithetical, but I actually think we've all become a trailer park. I think that's actually what has happened. So I say this as somebody
I grew up around trailer parks, so I'm not necessarily comfortable with this analogy, but keep going.
Hear me out. I say this as somebody who comes from a completely working class background. I grew up in a very working class background in a rural part of Washington State. In fact, Aberdeen, Washington, where Nirvana came from, right?
Yeah.
So that is a very notorious backward thinking small town going by the guys in Nirvana, right? I lived in the sticks outside of Aberdeen. I lived 40 minutes into the woods of Aberdeen, Washington. So I grew up in a very working class area, and I grew up in a trailer. So hear me out. I'm saying this partly from experience. I became a musician first and then later an academic because I was drawn to urban centers. I was drawn to culture. I was drawn to people doing their own thing, making their own thing happen, and being more interested in what they were working on than in being in everybody else's business, which is what the culture was I was often growing up in these small towns. Okay. So I ran toward what I saw at the time as civilization, as people producing something of their own work, from their own mind, their own passions, and being really involved in making something of themselves. And I really was bothered by this small town sort of gossipy culture. But that's the whole world now. We now live in a small town where everybody is in everybody else's business, and everybody has too much time on their hands. And again, I grew up in a trailer.
Especially with the pandemic, that gave us even more time on our hands to cause trouble.
It's just compounded the issue. So what I'm saying isn't a class thing at all. I grew up working class. That's not the issue. It's the mentality. It's the mentality of everybody being in everybody else's business. Social media is that now. And so because social media is worldwide and instantaneous, the whole idea of being in your neighbor's business, your neighbor is now everybody else on the planet.
Yeah, no, it's very true. An analogy that I used to make, well, I guess I still could make it if I can ever do corporate training in person again, is I would say that, we're more like high school than we ever want to admit, in that
Yes.
we're like high school with money. We didn't grow up and go to college and get more mature and professional and all this stuff. We descended back into the cliquish nation of high school, in which everyone has their groups and the groups are kind of going at each other and all this stuff, except we have money and we have technology. And now with the pandemic, a lot of us have more time.
Right. Absolutely. That's absolutely true.
All right, we got a couple questions that are kind of random, so this seems like a good spot for them. And then I do want to make sure we circle back to the 1619 project, not the 1669 project.
Very good.
The opinionated one wants to know, I agree that history departments have been much better about being more nuanced. Got a BS in history and poli-sci myself. Thoughts on the Virginia Confederate statues, especially Jackson and Lee in Lexington, Virginia?
Oh, great question. And that's also interesting. My minor was also poli-sci. It was legal studies. So I appreciate that. I don't have a particular stance on any monument necessarily, especially not Confederate monuments anywhere. I did a public lecture at Western Oregon University. There's a video of it. People can check out on YouTube, where I talked about the issue of the removal of monuments and whatnot. And I don't really have a specific stance on it, so much as it's up to the people in that given community to decide what they want. I mean, That's federalism, you know, people deciding for themselves what kind of community they want to live in. If that community becomes something they don't want to live in anymore, they can leave. And they can choose who their heroes are. And if some other community or people outside of that community aren't particularly happy with it, so be it. So my issue, especially with recent events, is the lack of legal process that's happening. It's the mob rule pulling down these monuments and whatnot. But if there are certain communities that want to retain certain monuments, including Confederate monuments, that's for that community to decide. That's how I see it.
I completely agree. I don't actually have much of an issue with having a discussion about taking down, I mean, I guess any monuments, but Confederate monuments specifically, but it should be a discussion and a debate and a dialogue, and not just a bunch of, 20-somethings who don't have jobs and are bored on a Friday night, want to pull down a statue and dump it into the bay in Baltimore or whatever it is.
Right. I think it's funny you say that, because I'm honestly not bemoaning any particular, certainly none of the peaceful protesters. There's been a lot of conflation between peaceful protests and riots. So I'm speaking specifically of rioters, specifically of people who are illegally pulling down monuments. I have to admit, I said this to my wife the other day, I have to admit, I wonder how many of these people were eating Tide Pods 2 years ago. You remember when like teenagers were eating Tide Pods like 2 years ago?
It's a great point.
I'm not saying it's the same people, but there might be a little bit of overlap.
I think that is very, very true. Marcia sends in a slightly off-topic question, but some do say the founders were more open of variations of Christianity and non-Christian religions, such as Islam. Also, is there real evidence of Turkish slaves left in NC 1500s?
Okay, I don't know about Turkish slaves.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean North Carolina? Is that?
I'm not sure, honestly.
I wish I could address that. I don't know that history, so I'm sorry I can't answer to that. So the founders were definitely generally more open-minded when it came to religious thought, and I say, pun not intended, thank God they were. Really religious pluralism, I think, is one of the things that is lacking right now, that the founders generally had a better idea of. Now, that's to keep in mind that in many ways the 13 colonies and the 13 original states were much more of a monoculture than what we have now. But I actually just did I just wrote like a 30-page paper a few months ago about Jefferson's study of Islam. And so I don't know about all of the framers, but certainly some of them, and Jefferson might be the best example. He took a very close look at Islam. And he did that for a few reasons. He did it initially when he was a law student because he wanted to understand how it was. Jefferson had a real problem with theocracies. And so he wanted to understand Islam not just as a religious system, but as a government system. Because, fundamentalist Islam is a theocratic idea. It's a merging of church and state, if you will. And so he was concerned about that. In the 1780s, Thomas Jefferson was in France, and he was ambassador in France. And he actually ended up dealing with a lot of the Barbary pirates, as they were called, in North Africa. And that paper that I wrote, what it actually ended up being about somewhat was how Jefferson went from, he wrote Virginia's religious statute of, Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, he wrote. And it got passed in Virginia while he was in France. And so he had battled the theocrats in his own backyard to establish religious freedom in Virginia, okay? And then the next thing he did was he went and he became ambassador in France, and he's dealing with a different form of theocrats in the form of these Barbary pirates. And so at every turn, for about 10 years, he's dealing with these sort of differing forms of people who want to merge church and state. And it's become so popular to criticize Jefferson, especially for his slaveholding, which is perfectly legitimate to do. But by focusing only on that, we forget that he was a real champion of religious freedom, probably the most important champion of religious freedom this country ever had.
Well, Sarah asked a question that's kind of related to this, and I have another follow-up question I want to get to. But Sarah asks, do you give any validity to David Barton's claims regarding the separation of church and state, referring to the Danbury letter?
Yeah, I think David Barton gets a lot of things wrong. I think he couches too much sometimes in the religious aspect of the founders. And I think he has personal reasons for doing that, but that's not to say that all of his history is off base. It's not, and I think he's right. And just to unpack that for people who are listening, the Danbury Baptist letter is a letter. I can't remember if it's from Jefferson or Madison to the Danbury Baptist, but basically what the whole point of it is that we today think of religious freedom and the relevant text in the First Amendment as protecting us from the church. But when it was written, it was to protect the church from the state. And that is a really important part of our history that we shouldn't forget. And a lot of us have never learned that religious freedom was so important that some of the aspects of the First Amendment, including the Establishment Clause, is all about protecting the church from the state, not the other way around, which is the way we often think of it today. And some of what David Barton talks about concerning the Danbury Baptist letter, I think, has to do with that.
Mm-hmm. Looking, through this lens of separation of church and state, I mean, some people at what is going on today, some people have argued, I am one of them, Tim Pool is one of them, I think James Lindsay is one of them, if my understanding is correct, that what we're seeing emerge in the country right now is kind of like a non-theistic religion in terms of Black Lives Matter, social justice, all of that. How do you perceive what's going on in the country right now with, kind of these historical references in mind?
Yeah, I do think it's a religion, although I think it's more accurate to call it a cult.
Yeah.
Because, and the way I'm going to differentiate the two, because I think there are plenty of people, including some atheists, who would not really see a difference between the two. But religions, kind of by their very nature, are interested in redemption, and there's no redemption in the woke cult. There is no redemption. There is.
That's interesting.
There are all sorts of sacrificial lambs, and there are certainly scapegoats, but there is not redemption, and I think that's an important part. I think it's too easy, especially for non-religious people, to misunderstand what we mean by calling it a religion. I think there are some very, there are religious people, I'll put it this way, there are religious people who believe in good faith debate and believe in redemption. And those are not things that we're seeing in the woke mob. And so I think I agree with you that there's a religious tendency, but I'm more comfortable with calling it a cult.
Mm-hmm. Has there been a time in American history when we've gone through something like this before, with a mass cult hysteria taking over?
Well, maybe McCarthyism. Mm-hmm. I don't know that even that compares, quite honestly. I think Eric Weinstein is right to call a lot of what we see left McCarthyism. He's called it. I think that's kind of a good way of putting it. Without being hyperbolic, I think it's fair to say that what we're seeing right now has not really ever been seen before. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In terms of its impact as well as how widespread it is.
Yeah. A couple people in the chat are saying the Salem witch trials, which I actually live about an hour away from Salem.
Sure.
In some respects, I think that could be an analogy.
Yeah. I mean, again, the Salem witch trials was very focused to, a particular event. You could at best say it was a series of events. It wasn't a national issue. And quite honestly, even in that area of Massachusetts, it became an embarrassment rather quickly.
Thank goodness for that.
Yeah.
Cult asks, if it is a religion, it would make metaphysical claims. Rather, it is an outgrowth of religion of postmodernism, which does make metaphysical claims. I don't know that all religions make metaphysical claims.
Yeah, I get what they're saying there. I would generally agree. I would generally agree with that.
Okay. So I want to make sure we just kind of circle back to the 1619 Project for a second. So the 1619 Project won a Pulitzer Prize.
Right. That's actually what motivated me to write this article.
What did you think when they announced that? I mean, I don't think it was like any great shock, but at the same time, it's like I'm not surprised, but I'm disappointed.
Yeah. Well, that's why toward the end of the article, I really, talk about that quite a bit. And I kind of really get to the point that the 1619 Project is bad history promoted by bad journalists via the New York Times, and has been awarded by what to me is now a non-legitimate prize. Like, it's pretty amazing to me. And also noted in the article is that one of the people, I think on the Pulitzer committee, if I'm remembering correctly, defended the prize even with its bad history, saying that, well, we really liked how it was written. It's like, so ostensibly the prize was for commentary. And I think that's one of the things that people miss, is that the 1619 Project won the Pulitzer for its prose, not for its history, because its history is wrong. It's broken. And but it was the Pulitzer Prize winning that really made me feel like I had to write something. And I sent it off to James Lindsay, and luckily he liked it enough to publish it pretty quickly thereafter.
Yeah. And one of the most terrifying passages for me in your entire piece is this one. You said, more than this, the Pulitzer Center, which is not associated with the Pulitzer Prizes, is now working in partnership with the 1619 Project in educational programming to engage students, according to the Pulitzer Center's 1619 Project website. Tell us more about that.
Right. I think one of the next things I say is that now bad history is not reserved for the readers of the New York Times. Because now they're designing curriculum based on the 1619 Project to teach in public schools. And this is horrifying to me. I actually, there were a couple of years there between my undergraduate experience and going to grad school, where I wasn't in school, and so I did some independent historical work. And one of the things I did was I designed an American Revolution course for 5th through 8th graders. And I did that primarily because my wife is a public school teacher. I believe very much in education and in public education, and they're already not doing well with their history, with teaching of history. And it's partly why I'm really empathetic to history professors, because they often get 20-year-olds in who never got any real history to begin with. And so they're playing catch up and forget having a nuanced conversation. A lot of people just haven't gotten the data, let alone how to process it. So that was also, I think, along with the Pulitzer, the fact, as soon as I learned that they were now going to turn this into curriculum for school kids, that really got my attention. That's also why I wanted to write this article, because I have nothing against Nicole Hannah-Jones. I have nothing against the 1619 Project, except that as a historian, I have to say it's not good history. And, I would say that about any project that is so blatantly wrong. And And part of the problem is that it's so blatantly wrong with its central thesis. That first essay's central thesis was that the American Revolution was done in order to protect slavery. That was its main thesis. It got its main thesis in its first essay wrong. And that's not a passable paper, in a good college history class. It's just absolutely absurd. And so, I have a number of different projects, one of which is called the Disabuse Project. My podcast is the Disabuse Podcast, and I do this other more education-based thing called the Disabuse Project. And the tagline is that historical literacy is a civic duty. I really believe that, and that's why I really take seriously the teaching of history to children. And to abuse that, to get it wrong for political aims, really gets to me.
Yeah. And it's especially infuriating because it seems as though she's even acknowledged on some level that the central thesis is wrong, because you write in your article that she said a correction will be made in later editions as well as when a book edition is published by Random House. But that correction hasn't been made, to the original essays. And so there's actually acknowledgement that they got this wrong and they're still proceeding forward with this anyway.
Well, and I don't know how do you correct the central thesis when the central thesis is exactly wrong? It's not a minor correction to be made. It's the entire point of the first essay is wrong. So how do you correct that?
Well, you can't. And they're just hoping that we're all going to forget, because that's what we do in our society of instant gratification. Right. All right, we got one more super chat, and then I have another question from locals that I think will just wrap this up nicely. So Darth, I don't know how to pronounce that. Are there parallels between today's wokeness and riots and revolutions of Russia, China, World War II, Italy, and Germany? Which I know is a lot. What do you think?
Sure. I would highlight, just from my point of view, China, the Cultural Revolution, I think is to some extent analogous, as is the Russian Revolution of the early 20th century, and the French Revolution. In all of these cases, you have the use of intimidation and terror in order to enact political aims. And you also have more than a little bit of exactly what we're talking about, which is an erasing of history or a manipulation of history for political aims. So certainly with some of those, I would definitely agree. Germany, I'm not so sure. I guess at some point, narrow-mindedness is narrow-mindedness. So that, you can call it whatever you want, and in some ways the result ends up being the same. But I think the most analogous examples to me would be the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, probably.
Okay. Matthew snuck another super chat in there. Thank you again, Matthew. Was McCarthy correct about communism in the US, and it took them this long to corrupt education, media, and business to push their ideology? That's actually a criticism, because I made a video, I think about a month ago maybe, where I said that we were going through another McCarthy era, and I got all these comments basically people saying, Carlin, McCarthy was right.
Well, there are plenty of really interesting historians, Tom Woods comes to mind, who have really shown that McCarthy was more correct than sort of mainstream history has admitted to. So what are the parameters, and how correct was he versus not? I do think it's fair to say he was more correct than, to this day, people tend to admit. But to compare what's going on now and sort of the growth of things over the past 20 or so years with McCarthy, I don't think that really works. I think it's more about, because I don't think McCarthy was thinking about things like the Frankfurt School. I don't know if McCarthy had any idea that there were academic Marxists, in his backyard, planning on getting cultural Marxism into the universities. Basically, right around the time that he was doing what he was doing, So I don't know that you can make that comparison except to maybe say he was more right in his own time and maybe really right in retrospect, but talking about now. Because the real influence, the real Marxism that's been an issue, his concern was infiltration of the American government. But what has really happened is cultural Marxism infiltrating the mainstream media, especially the journalistic press, and academia. That's really what we're reckoning with now. And that's different from what McCarthy was focused on, which was being concerned about Marxist sympathizers inside the State Department, for example.
Mm-hmm. How do you think we're going to come out of this?
Well, I'm ever an optimist because I have to be. Mm-hmm. And I think cooler heads prevail after the hotheads have exhausted themselves. And the cooler heads are the ones who are interested in nuanced conversation, talking about difficult truths, being willing to change their mind, and being willing to understand that they don't have all the answers and that they have things to learn from people, including and especially people they don't agree with. We're in the era where the hotheads are getting all the attention and they're sucking up all the air. But I'm optimistic that they will exhaust themselves. And the sort of apathetic people that kind of are a ring, if the hotheads are, if you think of it as like concentric circles, and the hotheads are this mass in the center, and they're making all the heat and they're sucking up all the air, then you have a ring of people who are trying to not pay attention, but it's getting harder and harder to not pay attention to what's going on. And then you have people on the most outer layer that might be the fewest of us, to be honest, but are willing to have those difficult conversations. The more the sort of hotheads exhaust themselves, the more they're going to convince people who generally don't want to think about this stuff to listen to more nuanced and articulate sort of debate. Because there's plenty of people, and it really doesn't matter what their political persuasion is. There's plenty of people who are like, well, if you want to get rid of that statue, create a forum and talk about it and convince people to get rid of that statue rather than, putting together a mob and tearing it down. At what point did the angry mob with pitchforks that was mocked in films like Frankenstein, at what point did the mob with pitchforks become the heroes? It's bizarre.
It is, yeah.
I think more and more people are getting really tired of that.
Yeah. I think the thing that worries me the most is I had a conversation with Carrie Smith from Unsafe Space on the channel last week, the week before, I don't remember at this point, but we talked about Harrison Bergeron, which is a short story by Kurt Vonnegut.
My favorite short story of all time.
Yeah, and I read this short story a while ago, but then Carrie told me that there was actually a movie that was made. Have you seen the movie?
Yeah.
So I watched it. It's like on YouTube. I watched it last week, and it was so striking to me at the end to watch how he tried to wake everyone up. He tried to tell them what was going on, but they were just so indoctrinated into everything and had been, completely engineered to kind of ignore the broader reality that they just didn't care. Right. And seeing that played out in a movie for me, I think it had a little extra emphasis because it's definitely I process information visually, I think. Mm-hmm. And so that was, in looking at what's going on right now, that's the most alarming thought to me, is that I agree with you. I think the hotheads are going to burn themselves out. At some point, they just can't. They're exerting way too much energy. Yeah. But does everyone else actually care is the question that I have to ask. I mean, I don't know. I don't know that they do.
I think they care in that they just want to get back to living their lives. And mm-hmm. they care that every single thing they say and everything they see is suddenly a political statement, or we're supposed to read it as a political statement. I think a lot of people are just really tired of the politicization of everything. And to what you were saying about Harrison Bergeron, I think this goes back a little bit to what we were talking about with democracy. I think it's a really important point that not enough people consider. And it's why the founders rejected direct democracy, kind of untainted democracy, because democracy in its purest form is a logical fallacy. Democracy is the bandwagon argument, right? It's an assumption that the most popular opinion is the right one. And there's plenty of us who realize that, well, actually, the most popular opinion could be a horrible idea, could be a horrible thing. And popularity of something in and of itself does not legitimize it. And so that's the problem with sort of kind of steamroller democracy. It needs to be nuanced with Republican, small r Republican values of individual rights.
Okay. Well, James, I just have one last question, and this I think is just a really good way to wrap it up. This comes from Lyndon Brook in my locals community, and essentially she's looking for reading material for people who want to read about history, or like what are good sources for people to read that aren't going to come with like an agenda and are going to show the good and the bad and things like that.
Okay, so just American history, U.S. history.
Well, let's stick to American history.
Yeah. So for the American Revolution and that era in the early Republic, I would recommend a few. Gordon Wood's Creation of the American Republic is a really important one. It's a very popular book, but it's still one of the best. A more recent work is Alan Taylor's American Revolutions, it's called, which is more of a sort of global perspective of the American Revolution. I would definitely go with those. Bernard Bailyn's The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution. That's a big one. I would. I don't think enough people think about the ideology, meaning the political philosophy that was attached to the American Revolution, and within that I include the American founding of the Constitution, because. And that's something that I write about quite a bit as well, that this political theory stuff matters, that separation of powers matters, making sure that the cop that arrests you is not the same person that is the judge that presides over your court appearance, and make sure it's not the same person that's sitting in the jury box judging your case. These are really, really important ideas, and they're fundamentally philosophical. And I think that sometimes people forget how important political philosophy is to the organization of government. And those history books I mentioned, Bernard Bailyn's Ideological History of the American Revolution, Creation of the American Republic by Gordon Wood, and Alan Taylor's American Revolutions deal with that aspect pretty well.
Well, thank you. That's enough to get us started for now. We appreciate that. James, this has been such a great conversation. I feel like I have to have you back sometime.
Please, that'd be great.
Awesome. Well, if you guys want to read James's article, which I definitely recommend, the link is in the description below. Also, you can find links to his podcast, which I will be joining him for an episode of his podcast at some point to be scheduled. So you can just definitely check him out. Now, this is not the only live stream I'm doing today. I'm doing a very special live stream that is not going to be remotely this serious at 9:30 tonight, which is the regular Tuesday night, nothing remotely controversial with Joshua. But tonight we have a special guest. Brandon Strzok from Walkaway is going to be joining us, and we're going to talk about his astrological chart. So we're going to go from something that's serious and academic to metaphysical and woo-woo. But, you have to balance these things out, right, James?
Of course, always.
So you can join us at 9:30 tonight for that. If you enjoyed this live stream, definitely subscribe to the channel, give it a thumbs up, all that good stuff, because I do try to do these on a very regular basis, and you always want to be notified. James, anything else you want to add, or any other places you want to direct people besides the links in the description?
No, that's great. And just thank you again for having me. And I hope we can do this again.
Absolutely. Well, I'll definitely have you back, because this has been fascinating. All right, everyone. Have a good rest of your day, and I'll be back at you soon.